This is George Gruhn at Gruhn Guitars, October 16th, 2020, for another question and answer session. As usual, in our pandemic days and close to the election, I can say it's a weird world out there. But people still want guitars, for which I feel very fortunate. Guitars really, while they have evolved greatly over the years, I can say that a 1935 Martin is still a thoroughly modern instrument, and a mid-1950s Stratocaster or Telecaster is thoroughly modern. 59 Les Paul has all the bells and whistles anybody could ever ask for. So a lot of times what we do transcends crazy times, changing technology, changing demographics, changing marketing schemes. Guitars still hang in there. And the ones that were highly sought after 50 years ago still are today the ones that are the most sought after by collectors. There's still some good new ideas coming along, but there's been remarkably little coming along that would in any way make a player think that the vintage originals were obsolete. I'd like to start, I'll introduce a couple of my folks. First, Joe Spann would like to talk about a couple of banjos, and he'll be on about 5 minutes explaining that, and then I'll be right back.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all safe and sound out there this morning. Today I'm going to talk about Gibson pre-war Mastertone Style 6 banjos. I have a beautiful example right here that you can see. The Style 6 superseded the Style 5 in August of 1928 and originally had Bella Voce pattern engraving and a natural finish rather than this beautiful Argentine gray stain. So the very earliest examples you will see have natural finish and Bella Voce inlay, or Bella Voce engraving. One distinctive thing that Style 6s have is this checkerboard edge binding. You can see it on the resonator and also on the fingerboard and also on the side of the neck. All of the Style 6 have this checkerboard trim edge binding and also a raised head tone ring. And I know some of you out there are saying, well, wait a minute, Joe, what about Style 6s with gold sparkle binding, edge binding? Well, that's what we're here to talk about. In January of 1929, Gibson came out with a brand new model that was never in the catalog. And here's a copy of the pamphlet for it. It was called the Royal PT. And it was the very first production Mastertone to have a flathead tone ring in it. I've got an example of a Royal PT neck right here. And you can see that it looks very much like the Style 6 neck, except it's got gold sparkle edge binding. And also, for those of you who are pretty sharp, you'll see that the neck is a little bit longer than a tenor neck. Also has a different scale length than a tenor neck. The idea behind the Royal PT was with a slightly longer neck than a tenor and a slightly shorter neck than a plectrum, you could tune it either way. So a person who could double, a musician who could double on tenor or plectrum could have one instrument. The problem was, though, when you tuned it like a tenor, the string tension was so tight, it didn't feel right. And when you tuned it like a plectrum, the string tension was so loose, it was very floppy. So the whole idea behind the Royal PT didn't last very long, and they had great difficulty selling them. But the point is, they had the very first production flathead tone rings. They were the same height as a standard ring that we think of today, but they weighed a lot less. Some of them even less than 2 pounds. So we see those out there today, and people commonly refer to them as flathead gold sparkle style 6, when in actuality they are not. They're a very rare model called a Royal PT. Now, sometimes you will see a true style 6 with gold sparkle edge binding, but the difference is it's got a raised head 40-hole tone ring. So your style 6 can have either checkerboard or gold sparkle edge binding, but it's a raised head banjo. Your Royal PT has a longer scale length with 20 frets, by the way, and always has the gold sparkle edge binding and a flathead tone ring. So just a little bit of minutia out there that I think is kind of interesting to tell the difference between a style 6 and a Royal PT. Thank you, George.
All right. I'm gonna now, I've had a couple of people who've asked questions on electric guitars that are specialized enough that I'd like to bring on Lynn Croson from our repair staff. Lynn has been with us for quite a few years. His specialty is vintage electric guitars, which he is extremely knowledgeable on and extremely skilled in repair. And he handles some of our most challenging jobs in that area. So I'm going to bring him on to respond to 2 questions that have been submitted by readers. Here's Lynn.
How are you all doing today? My name is Lynn, and I'm here to talk about, Warren has asked some questions about his 1985 L5 that the pit guard gassed off and has corroded all of his hardware. And he was asking whether or not he should keep the covers or should he replace them, because the rest of the guitar looks really good. Well, if you replace your covers, you are going to devalue the instrument a little bit. So I wouldn't really suggest doing that, but you can take it to a professional and have them clean that and make it look better. It's never going to look, original again. Even if you have it replated, if you remove the covers and have them replated, it's not going to look the same again. It'll look close, but it won't look exactly the same. And he's also asked a question about whether or not he should keep the case with the guitar because the acid has leached into the case itself. Well, you can actually clean that with a baking soda style upholstery cleaner because that will neutralize the acid. But I would also, do things like leave it outside and let it naturally air out itself. But I wouldn't keep it necessarily in there while the gas is still active. If you can smell it, it's active. So I would clean that with a baking soda style cleaner, and hopefully that will get taken care of. And the next one is from, I got a couple of questions from Karsten Haslett, and he was asking the differences between a vintage style guitar and a new style guitar. And you can make a new instrument that sounds very similar to the old instruments. You've got things going on with different metals that they were using back then, plus the woods are older and cleaner in a way. So you can get pretty close with emulating the way that things were done back there. You just have to realize that there's a lot of minutia that goes into that to really make that different. I mean, the metals, the woods, the glues that they were using, and everything. So you can go through and pretty much make a product that will sound and feel like an older instrument. There's just something about the older ones that they've got that soul and they've been around forever. So they've just got something else going on with them. He also asked a question about pots and wanted to know the difference in using different pots. Well, basically a 250K versus a 500 versus a 1 meg. If you're using a 1 meg pot, you're going to get brighter sound. If you use a 250, it's not going to be as bright. So that's why you generally see humbuckers using 500Ks, because they're a warmer pickup that you want to try to brighten up. And that can also explain why some of the Telecasters from the late 60s on into the 70s are a lot brighter in their sound, because the late 60s they started using 1 meg pots, which were very bright. So that's why one of the differences of those pickups sounding different in the later years. He also asked a question about the lifespan of Fender pickups, and there's really no definite lifespan. I mean, they could last forever, and they could last 2 weeks after they were made. And one of the big reasons is because Fender pickups really are just a piece of fiberboard, and magnets. And wire is wound directly around the magnets, so you get chemical reactions between the coil wire and the lacquer on the magnets. You also get sweat that leaches down in and will cause your wire to rust. So there are different things that cause pickups to die. It's not necessarily they're built to die or anything like that. So there's not really a definite lifespan. So you may never have to rewind a pickup. And like I've seen guitars that all 3 pickups, Stratocaster, all 3 pickups need to be rewound. It just got played hard enough and got a bunch of sweat leached in. And that's generally when you take a pickup apart, a lot of times right up at the very top, right around the 2 E poles is rust, and that's where they tend to die mostly. And he's also asked what he looks for, or what we look for when we're inspecting pickups. And when you're inspecting a pickup, you want to look at the solder joint. You want to look at any wax that's built up. You want to look at, and that's Fender pickups mostly with the wax. You also want to look if it's been lacquer potted. You want to check the solder joints to make sure they're all right. You want to look for the different tooling and machining marks that are left that you'll always see for the time period that you're looking for. So basically, it's looking at a lot of them and kind of knowing what you're looking for the time period, the pickup that you're looking for. Well, I hope that answers both of y'all's questions, Karsten and Warren. And I'll give it back to George now. Y'all have a nice Friday and a nice weekend.
All right. So we have plenty more questions. So one from John Myers. I'm not sure if I covered it last week, but fretboard binding separations on some modern Martins, and similar thing on a Steve Miller Pegasus model Martin that he got. And the question was there a manufacturing issue with some of the limited edition Martins? And I can tell you that Martin's workmanship is uniformly extremely good, but there have been occasions when there have been quality problems with subcontractors. Quality of Ivoroid bindings in recent years has not been, in some cases, as good as it was in the good old days. And there have been some issues with binding shrinkage that Martin didn't control. There's been problems with lacquer formulations, not so much lately, but back Sherwin-Williams, for example, back in the 1970s, changed their lacquer formula, and it not only caused Martin tremendous grief, it came close to bankrupting Mossman guitars. It almost bankrupted Gallagher guitars. By lacquer, the manufacturer changes the formula, doesn't tell you, and you find something that worked for years all of a sudden goes bad, and you spray it and everything looks fine, and then by the time it's 6 months old, it's flaking off. And this is not a defect of manufacturing. It is a defect of product supplied to the manufacturer that went bad. And when you have a finish or binding that's on a guitar and it goes bad on the finished product, you can have a huge problem because they warranty their guitars, and the costs of warranty and the amount of labor that goes into a refinish on a guitar that has a problem of that kind can be such that it's cheaper for the manufacturer to make another guitar than it is to strip the finish and try to refinish it where it looks truly right. And a related question, from Michael, related in some ways to the first question about pick guards that outgas. Michael, why do the aged Gretsch guitars, 1960s specifically, have such terrible binding breakdowns? Are the newer Gretsch bindings any better in that they will not crumble and fall off the instrument in the years ahead? Currently, I own a 1966 Gretsch Tennessee and the 2014 Gretsch Tennessee Rose, 2016 Gretsch Amber Tiger. Well, your modern ones probably aren't going to give any problems, but your 1966 Gretsch Tennessean, over time, if it hasn't already, will very likely have crumbling bindings that will need to be replaced because they will outgas toxic, corrosive fumes, as well as cause the binding to crack, crumble, and eventually just turn to dust and fall off. But this has been mentioned before in previous weeks that Gretsch bought their binding from the same folks that supplied bindings to other New York area makers. So some of the Angelicos, Premier brand, Gretsch, Epiphone, and even some guilds had problems. They were all New York area, New York or New Jersey, right across the Hudson River, same basic area. And they bought some of their plastics from the same folks. And Gretsch's, particularly those late 50s into the 60s, throughout the 60s, the bindings were very problematic. They had no way of knowing that it was going to do that. If the stuff has a 40-year time fuse before it blows, they didn't know. And in fact, many of the makers, the workers and the company owners, by the time the problem cropped up, some of them were already dead. They weren't expecting it to be a problem. It was not a problem of integrity of the manufacturer. It's a problem of subcontractors, and in some cases, plastics that were relatively new on the market, even the makers of the plastic did not realize that they would go bad and effectively decompose and cause huge problems over time. Wood bindings don't do that. Genuine ivory doesn't do that. Genuine tortoise shell doesn't do that. But you can't use genuine ivory or genuine tortoise shell anymore, and rightfully so. Those are animals that are very endangered. You can use wood bindings, and wood bindings can last for hundreds of years. Stephen asks, is there any difference in tonal quality with a slot head versus a solid peg head because of the break angle? It might be interesting to see a 12 fret 00028 with a solid peg head. And in fact, Martin did build, and according to their records, at least in 1930, there's a 0028H Hawaiian that had a solid peg head. And I have seen others that were 0028s, 1933, that had 12 fret neck, but solid peg head. They're very rare, and they're great sounding guitars, but the break angle of the strings is different. And it's easy enough to compare. Here is a slotted peg head. This is a 1922 Martin 0042 guitar. Nice abalone trim on the edges, good guitar. But you can see that it has a slotted peg head, and if you look closely, you can also see that the strings posts are in the middle of the peg head. So essentially, this break angle over the nut is a peg head that has about the same angle backward as on a standard 14 fret neck with a solid peg head. But instead of the post sticking up, they're recessed halfway into the peg head. So this break angle of strings, this angle of the strings over the nut is considerably steeper angle here, more pressure downward on the nut. It's a D28 made in 1941, and it has the standard solid peg head. You can see that the posts stick up, so the angle of the strings over the nut on this would exert considerably less pressure downward than on a slotted peg head. Is the difference in tone instantaneously recognizable to just anybody? It's subtle, but there is a difference. And I happen to like the slotted peg heads very much, but they are more time consuming to restring. The solid peg head certainly is easier to restring. A question from Jerry Wixentowski: what are the similarities and differences between Gibson's advanced jumbo versus the Martin D28 of the day, which the advanced jumbo is a model made by Gibson, introduced in late 1936, and no longer made after 1939, although two were shipped in 1940, but that was leftover stock. The first one was shipped October 13th of 1936, and it is a slope-shouldered dreadnought. Here is an advanced jumbo. This one is a 1938 model. This particular one looks fine, but it has a replaced top. The top was very professionally done. Expert luthier did the work. It is an Adirondack spruce top, just like the original, braced the same way. It's a fine sounding guitar. But this at least looks like what an advanced jumbo is like. You notice the inlay pattern has that kind of distinctive two arrowhead shapes, and the square, such that it looks like a diamond shape with two arrowhead shapes on either side. And this is a pattern that was used by Gibson only on the advanced jumbo. This model features rosewood back and sides. It's also the only catalog described model Gibson dreadnought made pre-World War II. And while many people are under the mistaken impression that it's Brazilian rosewood because it was made back in the 30s, it is in fact Indian rosewood. The bridge and fingerboard are Brazilian rosewood, but the back and sides are Indian rosewood. Fingerboard is single bound, top is single bound, back is also single bound white. Neck is mahogany, and they had the typical pre-World War II open back rover tuners. And what Jerry is basically asking is to compare and contrast the similarities between the advanced jumbo and the D28. The D28 Martin was Martin's best-selling rosewood dreadnought pre-war. In fact, pre-World War II, Martin in dreadnought size only made style 18, 28, and 45. But in my opinion, the advanced jumbo is probably the best sounding flat-top acoustic guitar that Gibson ever made in the entire history of the company. Clean, fully original examples bring about $60,000 today, and they are fabulous sounding guitars. Do they sound identical to a D28? No, but they have great volume, great tone, and they are an amazingly good sounding guitar. Cost new at that time was $80, whereas at that time the D28 Martin sold for $100. And as we showed a moment ago, a 41 D28, I'll bring out that same one again. The D28 is a square-shouldered dreadnought. The back and sides are Brazilian rosewood. It has a zigzag type back stripe, whereas the advanced jumbo has no ornamentation on the center seam of the back. The D28 has white binding on the front and back. It has herringbone trim on the front, and on the back, as you can see if you look close, it is triple bound. The fingerboard is unbound, has little slotted diamond-shaped inlays on the fingerboard. It has, this one has closed back Grovers. Most had open back, but in late 39 and 40, some of them came with these covers on the back. So these are original Grover tuners with closed backs. Some of the nicest tuners Martin ever had pre-World War II. Ebony fingerboard and bridge rather than rosewood. Nitrocellulose tortoiseshell grain guard. And interestingly enough, the nitrocellulose on Martin guards very rarely decomposes. And the ivory bindings on Martin guitars very rarely decompose. If you see cracks and deterioration of ivory bindings on a Martin, typically that is a sign that the instrument has been refinished and that somebody used chemical stripper, which damaged the binding. Because the type chemical strippers people use for paint stripper are incompatible with plastics. And the ivory is a nitrocellulose type of plastic, which is very prone to damage if it is in contact with chemical paint stripper. The sound of a D28 is great. It's not the identical same sound as an advanced jumbo, although it's remarkably close. It may be the Gibson that sounds the closest to a good Martin. And if anything, the Gibson AJ does demonstrate what a fabulous guitar you can build with Indian rosewood. There were some great classical makers. One of the most noted, Hermann Hauser the first. Segovia played one of his guitars. And a good Hermann Hauser the first will bring well over $100,000. He offered the option of Indian rosewood or Brazilian rosewood on his guitars and charged exactly the same price either way. The cost of Brazilian versus Indian rosewood in the 1930s was hardly different at all. So the AJ is a great guitar, as is the D28. Another interesting point is the inlay pattern on the Gibson is actually not totally unique in terms of it didn't suddenly appear on Gibsons with no prior precedent from anybody else. In 1928, the National style number 4 tricone had this inlay pattern. And you'll notice right there at the 12th fret, that inlay is the same pattern as on the advanced jumbo. Probably a bit much for pure coincidence. So there it is, but it didn't have it all the way up and down the way the Gibson does. The Gibson used it up and down on the fingerboard and on the peg head. Interestingly enough, too, in 1932, the Model 206 and Model 156 Dobro had a similar type pattern, although you can see that the pieces are much closer there. But still, it's the same basic design, although here, as you can see in the 28 National, that inlay is virtually identical to the advanced jumbo pattern. It happens to be a pattern I personally like real well. In fact, on the new Gruhn electric Avatar model, my design, there it is. It's the same basic pattern, although I put abalone center wedges, and instead of graduated size, these inlays are uniform size. There it is. So it's a pattern I personally find very appealing. Onward, Adam Abelson asks, are you familiar with Cole Clark guitars, their use of sustainable woods, Australian, and their 3-point pickup / mic approach to amplification? Can you share your thoughts on their instruments? We have been dealing those for some time. They're made in Australia. They are mostly very plain in ornamentation, but very good quality craftsmanship, and very specifically designed to perform well as acoustic electrics. They sound good acoustically, but they sound their best plugged in. And they're very deliberate in having a system that is set up to minimize feedback so that you can, if you find that there's any feedback point, you can actually dial it out. And the way their pickups are mounted is very resistant to feedback. And I consider the Cole Clark to be fine guitars suitable for professional performance. So Australia has 2 rather noted builders for acoustic electric guitars, Maton, it's endorsed by Tommy Emmanuel, and Cole Clark, and the folks who build Cole Clark are ex-Maton folks, so that there is certainly that tie that Australia, in spite of the fact the entire continent has a total population no greater than the metropolitan greater New York City area, there's a remarkable amount of good craftsmanship going on in Australia. Examples, Steve Gilchrist and Paul Duff, 2 very noted mandolin builders, are both in Australia. But any Australian maker that achieves significant size and sells significant volume is probably going to be dependent to a large extent on the export worldwide market, because Australia, again, is a market of their own citizens no greater than metropolitan greater New York City area. I have a question from Rob Mend. What is your take on the Gibson Spotlight Special Les Paul? That is a model that was made from 1983 through 1984. It has ornamentation essentially very similar to a Gibson Les Paul standard. Has a curly maple top. What is significantly different on immediate sight is a Spotlight Special. It has a strip of walnut that's about 3 inches wide that goes right down the center of the top. So there's a maple, walnut, and then more maple, but the walnut strip of considerable width in the middle of the top is a very noted feature. It does have multiple binding on the top edge of the body. Same inlay pattern as a Les Paul standard. 2 pickups, same wiring scheme as a Les Paul standard. Gold-plated metal hardware, and is a relatively limited quantity of those produced. The current Vintage Guitar magazine got price guide states 4,500 to 5,900. I haven't gotten 5,900 for any of them, but we don't see a lot of them. But as far as 4,500 to 5,000, yes. And I guess if you had a squeaky clean one with the right beautifully figured curly maple, there may be somebody out there who's paid 5,900, but it's hard to apply supply, demand, and prior precedent with great ease on that model. They just didn't make very many. And it's not something that we see used on stage much, but they are good quality guitars. Going onward. Jeffrey, can you tell the group the story of your most extreme restoration of a valuable rare guitar that was butchered by someone seemingly beyond hope, but your crew was able to bring back to life? Whatever happened to it after the restoration? Well, we just happen to have a guitar right over close. I will get it. Here is a 1931 Martin OM-28. As you can see, it looks like it has some moderate normal wear. Nice scratches on the back. But it's a fine guitar. And the OM-28 is the model that was the first Martin guitar model to feature a 14-fret neck on a 6-string guitar. So it's historically a very significant instrument. But when we received this guitar, which was about 19 years ago, it was sent to us as a box containing a bunch of pieces. It was all pieces of the same guitar, but the guitar was literally so-called basket case. Nothing was together on it. It was literally pieces, and there were some segments of wood that were just missing. This was quite a project, but it did get finished 18 years ago. The work was done, and the missing segment on the back is such that even with a magnifying glass and studying it carefully, the best way to tell that it has a missing segment that doesn't quite match would be to X-ray it, because every grain pattern lines up where they didn't. They've been painted back, and it looks like it never was broken. It took months of work, but there it is. It's a fine sounding guitar. It's structurally stable. It has held up very well for the past 18 years. We sold it to Jeff Hanna of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, and he used the guitar, has used it for the past 18 years. There it is. And it's a fine guitar. it is still represented as what it is, that it has been restored. But it is a great sounding guitar. It's a piece of memorabilia. It's a piece of pretty incredible restoration work that we're very pleased to say, well, it was the result of months of work on one instrument, turned out incredibly well. And I defy almost anybody to find a segment of wood that was actually spliced in, although we know it's there and we know where. But there it is, and it is currently available. It can be had at this time for $45,000. We have another one, the same year, same model. Right here. This one was not broken. The bridge was split, and we replaced the bridge. We reset the neck, which is pretty typical on something made in 1931, that it's going to need a neck set after that many years of string tension. The tuners have been replaced because it originally had banjo tuners that didn't tune very well, but they'd been replaced many, many years ago. And when we got this guitar in, it had some very poor quality Japanese-made tuners. So at any rate, it now has proper 1930s style tuners. 31 was the transition year in which mid-year Martin went from banjo pegs to open back Grovers, and for a practical utility use, we opted, rather than putting banjo pegs back on it, which don't tune well and proved not to be popular when they were new, we went ahead and set it up with the vintage style Grover type gears that are what was used from mid-31 onward. So this is another fine example, but this one is now $52,500. So it's priced a bit more than the one that we restored. This one does not have the memorabilia appeal of having been owned and used by Jeff Hanna with the Dirt Band, but it is a historically very, very significant guitar. Put it back. Now, Jeffrey also goes on to say, along that line last week, you mentioned your disgust for folks that butcher guitars. If someone comes in that you know through reputation or firsthand knowledge has a history of butchering guitars, would you refuse to sell a guitar to them? And in one word, the answer is yes, I would refuse. So I will not sell. Running an adoption agency for guitars. I would buy a guitar from somebody like that to rescue it if they haven't yet butchered it, but I certainly don't want to sell them a guitar if their track record is that every one they get, they immediately modify. That's just something that to me is absolutely abhorrent, and I will not do that. But I do have an example of another instrument that, but not to do. We don't know who did this, but if you look close at the heel of this banjo, you'll note that it has elaborate carving. It has the head. You can see it's beautifully carved. And the dowel stick is also carved, and this was S.S. Stewart. This instrument would be from the late 1880s from Stewart in Philadelphia, but unfortunately the body is an early 1900s student model clunker banjo body. And looking closely at the instrument, this nice peg hanging lay. This was a presentation grade Stewart at the time it was made, but you can note that it's coming apart up here. They cut the neck, and it was a 5-string banjo with a long neck, and they wanted a tenor, so they cut it and this much here. This part is original. This part is original, and this middle section of the neck is gone. And these pearl dots are typical of Stewarts that were fretless. The early Stewarts were not fretted. It was in the 80s, mid 80s, that they started doing fretted rather than fretless Stewarts. But this would originally have been a fretless presentation grade banjo. And at this point, the neck has essentially been destroyed. The instrument has virtually no value today except for show and tell, to say that this is an example of what not to do. They had an instrument that, if it had been left alone, would be worth easily $5,000 to $6,000 today, and currently is, I wouldn't even call it a decorative wall hanger. It's an example of a bit of butchery that we would hope that no one listening to me would do to any instrument they have, even if you don't like banjos, you shouldn't do that to it. And if you have guitars, if you have one that you think would be more playable to you, hot rodded in a way that permanently alters it, it's worth stopping to think that if you don't do that type of modification, you could easily trade it for something that you do like and probably have thousands of dollars left over. There's no good reason to permanently alter specs on a highly collectible vintage instrument because it doesn't produce a great result, and it certainly causes an enormous monetary loss of value, but it's also a piece of history that is destroyed. I tend to view the instruments as almost alive. I feel that they have soul and personality, but certainly a good one with proper care can last far longer than human lifetime. If you permanently modify it for the rest of history, it is lost to us. If it's preserved, it can be enjoyed by future generations. And the reason that we still have Stradivari's and Guarneri's and Guadagnini's and some of those old fine Italian violins is that there were collectors who did preserve and protect them and kept them from being harmed. If everything is just used until it is just thrashed to death, but also modified, hot rodded, it's lost as a collectible. Salvador Dali could paint a mustache on a replica of the Mona Lisa, but he didn't do that on the real thing. If someone were to buy an original Picasso or Rembrandt or Jackson Pollock, Van Gogh, whatever, and decide that they own it, it's theirs, they can do what they want, and they maybe burn it in anger or decide they know more about painting and they'll just modify it. Well, an art dealer might have sold it to them and gotten $50 million, but I can pretty well assure you that if you took an original Van Gogh, even if you paid $100 million for it and you decided to modify it or destroy it deliberately, that you'd be very, 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 very hard pressed to find any dealer who would ever sell another to you for any price, whatever. I view it almost as a crime against humanity. So in the art world, people feel that more than they perhaps do in the guitar world. But as values get higher, you do that, find an original, explore a Gibson and decide to carve your name on it or modify it with inlays that are not original or change the pickups, you'll have a hard time finding dealers who want to do business with you. And there'll be a bunch of people quite upset. Steve says, the D18 sinker I bought from you folks sounds terrific. In your opinion, do they sound similar to any particular vintage Martin? I guess the answer to that is the closest a D18 sinker comes would be the sound of a 1930s forward shifted scallop brace D18. But do they truly sound identical? The answer is no. Part of it is that there is a certain element of aging that is not necessarily a matter of good versus bad, but there's a certain type sound as the finish and the wood are really, really thoroughly cured that it does change. The new ones can sound extremely good. And I think that the new D18 sinkers, as well as the other sinker models, the OM sinker, they sound very much like the old ones did when they were new. You know, the 12 fret quadruple O and the 14 fret quadruple O don't directly have a comparison in a pre-World War II Martin, because Martin didn't do those sizes pre-war. The 12 fret quad, they had to make a new body form to do them for me because they never had made a guitar in that particular size. And the 14 fret quad is the same size as the pre-war Model F arch tops, but they did not do a flat top equivalent pre-war. So those have their own sound, but they still sound very much like 1930s Martins. They are fine instruments, and the closest they come will be the 1930s Martins. And as time goes on, they'll probably come closer and closer over the years. But are they identical? The answer is no, but they sure are close. Another person whose name coincidentally is George says, I was looking at both the 2020 Martin D41 and D45 guitars. For example, the D41 was approximately $5,000, give or take, and the D45 was approximately $8,000, give or take. They sound similar, look similar, and I know that Martin craftsmanship is held to the same uncompromising standards on both guitars. Why would someone consider paying an extra $3,000 for the D45? I'm curious if there are benefits to purchasing the D45 that I don't know about. Well, they do look similar from the front. The D45, however, has the abalone trim on the sides and on the back, whereas the 41 has it only on the front. They also make a D42 that has from the front, it looks identical to a D45 with the snowflake inlay pattern rather than the hexagons. And I happen to really like the D42, and D41 is also a very good guitar. So far as from the front, does a D42 look any different from a D45 with snowflake inlay pattern on the board? The answer is no, it doesn't. Does it sound different? Nope. Does it feel different? Nope. With your eyes closed playing it, would you know the difference? Nope. The D45 does have more labor and has the amount of pearl on it. The sides alone have more linear inches of pearl than the top has on a D45. And then you add the pearl on the back, that's, again, a lot of pearl. So there's more than twice as much linear inches of abalone trim on a D45 as on either a D41 or a D42. But so far as bracing pattern, size, wood, they're the same. And from the front, is the audience going to see the difference? No. But some people just want to get the top of the line model. And for that, you pay extra. But if you're thinking of it in terms of playability, they're the same. And in terms of resale value, well, a D45 will bring more money, but it starts out by costing you more money. If you're reselling one, you can do quite well either way. So if your budget is such that you'd like to save some money and still have a pretty guitar, you can do that. Or you can get a new Sinker Mahogany Martin D18 that we sell, custom shop guitar with a Sinker neck block, end block, interior linings, and then ebony board and bridge and Adirondack spruce that is naturally aged for the top. They may not look fancy, but they have as much ornamentation as a Stradivari or a Del Gesù Guarneri violin. And $3,750 for the D, or $3,850 for the quadruple O, 14 fret, or the OM. And my ear really likes the Adirondack spruce, the new D41, D42, or the new D45 have Sitka spruce tops. And there is a difference in sound between Sitka and Adirondack. And I have on many occasions said that I prefer Adirondack, and not changing my line on that. But it's going to be certainly a significant amount of personal preference. If you want flash, physical appearance, fancy, to impress folks, the D41 and the D42 will do just fine because they have all the ornamentation that people notice from the front view. Not very many people look close at the very thin line abalone trim on the sides and back on the D45, but it is there. But the audience will rarely see it. As far as just pure sound, the blindfold test, my favorite new guitars are still custom shop with Adirondack top that is not heat treated. And I haven't had any new guitars that I like better than the new Sinker Mahogany Martins. Paul says, over the years, I've seen Fender solid body guitars that have custom color finish applied over sunburst, and others where the clear coat appears to have been skipped. And as a consequence, the color has remained relatively unchanged. In addition, a few examples have faux wood grain effect beneath a sunburst or blonde lacquer finish. That's something that was done a bit in the 60s on Tellys. Would you talk about these and comment on why these procedures took place, particularly the faux wood grain, and what, if any, effect this has on the instrument's value? I think when Fender was doing the faux wood grain, they had some crummy looking wood, and that was when CBS was the owner of Fender, and quality was certainly not as big a consideration. That something that overall, when Fender did finishes painted over sunburst, they usually didn't, if something didn't turn out great on the burst, they could do a solid color over it. Or if they got an order and they had a bunch of sunbursts, more than they needed. They could just spray right over one. There were also in the UK distributors like Selmer that would overspray finishes. So they were the UK distributor for a while for Fender, and they often did something after the fact. They would receive sunburst guitars, but if they had orders that people wanted one that looked like Hank Marvin's guitar, they would spray it right there in the UK, right over the burst. And those are still plenty collectible, but not as collectible. But in general, what I think is going to be the most collectible will be finishes that are not sprayed over sunburst, but still, if it was done at the factory, it still can be considered original, and it still will be plenty valuable. It can be more valuable than it might have been just as sunburst if it was done at the factory originally, but probably not as appealing to most collectors as if it was done not over sunburst, but still at the factory. But over the years, there's been lots of variations on what Fender would do for custom finishes. And there's also enough confusion on custom finishes that sometimes, frankly, it's pretty hard to tell what's original and what isn't. Even as much as 30 years ago, I was finding it became increasingly more and more difficult. And Tom Murphy told me a story, and he's known because he's one who does relic finishes for Gibson, but he also is known as an expert refinisher. And he told me that this is probably at least 20 years ago. He was at a guitar show, saw a candy apple red Fender Stratocaster. The price was enough that it could leave him some margin to resell it to the person he knew that he'd like, was looking for one. He picked it up, bought it. The pots were a little scratchy, so he lifted the guard to get at the electronics to clean them. There was an autograph on that guitar, on the body, right under the pick guard. And the most ironic one for it to be. It was signed Tom Murphy, indicating that he had refinished it. So his own finish work fooled him, but it didn't fool him once he got the thing apart. But unless you get the guard off and look in the cavities and see some of the really distinctive tooling marks in there that are likely to be gone if anybody had stripped it and then refinished it, done any sanding, sometimes it's really, really difficult. The quality of refinish work these days is enough to be scary. So when buying custom color finishes, buyer beware that not everything is as it seems. I have a question from John. What's a good guitar for a kid to get started on? I like the traditional Martins the best, but I always find the smaller, less expensive Taylor models to be far more interesting to me than the comparable models from Martin. What's your recommendation for early Christmas shoppers? Well, actually, Martin and Taylor both do make some lesser models. And in each case, each company has a factory in Mexico where that is done. None of the US-made Martins or the US-made Taylors are ultra cheap, but they do start for USA models in the $1,250 range, $1,250 on up. There are some US-made Martins, and for Taylors, it's also true that they have models made in the US that are still pretty darn good. The DSS 17 Martin that has a map price of $1,559 is a really, really good guitar. It's an amazingly good guitar. And Taylor has a similar model, a Grand Pacific size, that is slightly less priced than the DSS 17, not by much less, but still it's got their new V-brace designed by Andy Powers. It's a remarkably good guitar, and they do offer some smaller models, so it depends on the price bracket. Bang for a buck, I happen to be very impressed with some of the Seagull brand guitars made by Godin in Quebec, Canada. And we actually have a model, their so-called solid wood series, where they offer a cutaway OM size guitar with a factory installed pickup that has a MAP price of $999. And it's an amazingly good guitar. I'm not sure what your Christmas stocking price is, but Seagull has other models that are in the $400 to $450 bracket that are still, for the price, remarkably good. And I think that if you're going to get a kid a guitar to learn on, that you ought to get something that's fun to play. If it's physically uncomfortable to play for an adult, don't expect the kid with tender fingers that are not yet calloused to do well on it. They won't. And if the tone is tinny and irritating sounding, don't expect that to inspire them to learn. It won't happen that way. The guitar needs to be physically comfortable. In fact, I like relatively medium high action. It suits what I do, but that doesn't mean the average beginner wants it that way. A beginner needs an instrument that is physically easier to play than many professionals would prefer. A lot of pros want an instrument that may fight back a bit, but you can have more dynamic range that way. You can play it harder, and you can still play soft or medium. But for the beginner, it needs to be easy to play and have a reasonably pleasant, mellow sound. Otherwise, it's going to discourage them from learning. And there are good options out there in imports that can be had. And the Canadian import is remarkably competitive. And it's really good guitar. And for $450, you can get a Seagull brand that's quite good. And for $999, you can get a Seagull brand that actually gives a real run for the money to some guitars that are much more expensive. And there are Asian imports too that are quite playable. And for electric guitars also, there are Mexican as well as Asian imports that play well and sound good. The quality of student guitars today is far better than it was when I was starting out in the early 1960s. The Harmony and K guitars that were available for beginners were made in the US, mostly in Chicago. The Dan Electros were made in Neptune, New Jersey. And Dan Electros were pretty cheap. They were sold through Sears as well as other outlets. But they played surprisingly well. The pickups were very functional. They may not have been fancy, but they actually sounded good. Lots of really great guitar players started out on a Dan Electro electric guitar. So that's something that's worthy of consideration. So we have more questions that have come in. L.J. Mattingly, what are your opinions of Mossman guitars? Well, Mossman guitars have gone through a number of iterations. The original ones made by Stu Mossman started out in the very early 1970s and were made right on up into, actually not very much after about 76 or 77. They had a factory fire, and they had a problem with Sherwin-Williams lacquer that I mentioned earlier. Both of those two combined to pretty well put them out of business. And then Stu decided to just retire from it. He also was developing an allergy to lacquer. And so all of those factors got him out. Now later, Scott Baxendale got that brand name. He bought the rights to it, and he made Mossman guitars that were similar but not identical. And that went on for a few years, and then it got sold again. So there's at least 3 separate Mossman ownerships, made different owners, different city, really different construction, and the name goes on, but the guitar, the original Mossman guitars were made at a time in the 70s when Martin and Gibson both, and Fender too, had quality that had gone down, but Fender wasn't making acoustics at that time, but Martin and Gibson certainly were. And Mossmans were sold, being touted as being superior to the Martins and Gibsons of that time. They certainly were superior to the 1970s Gibson acoustics. I think it's rather debatable if they were really better than the Martin acoustics. The Martins of the 70s typically had good workmanship, but the setup work was not great. Martin would have the philosophy that the dealer should set them up and lower the action to whatever the customer wanted. So they came in with very, very high action at the nut and the saddle. And then if you were a bluegrasser and you wanted it high, they didn't take it down much. And if you wanted to play finger picking and other stuff, they'd take it down a lot more. But if you didn't have any dealer setup work, it was darn near unplayable. The Mossmans were more playable, but in my experience, do I think that the Mossman guitars are superior to 1970s Martins? The answer is no, I don't. I'd rather have the Martin. And they did make some fancy ones. They had a golden era model that they had some with abalone trim and fancy. They did a few in Brazilian rosewood, but I find they'll bring less money than an equivalent ornamented Martin. Joe Miller, would you recommend to Plek a guitar? The Plek machine is a machine that is computer driven and can adjust frets, adjust action, dress frets, cut fret slots. If your guitar needs that kind of work, it's great, but that doesn't mean that everybody should do it. But if you need it done, lots of factories do that. In the production process, the Plek machine is very accurate. It's not something that we would use on vintage guitars. Anyway, we've got, do we have any other questions left? Let me add it. What are your thoughts on repairing crumbling binding on 1960s era Gretsch Country Gentleman when it doesn't impact playability? Keep it there, replace it to look better. Well, the problem is that the crumbling binding is outgassing toxic and corrosive fumes. And if you don't do anything, it will eat your frets, it will eat the case lining, it will do harm. And it's also something that will likely, if you get it on you, be likely to be causing allergic responses and is even toxic enough to be carcinogenic. So would I do something about it? I darn well would. So I don't recommend leaving that alone. And if it doesn't affect playability, it will soon enough, because when the binding just simply falls off the fingerboard, then your fret ends are going to stick out and poke you, and you will bleed. So at any rate, there's good reason to do something about it. Whatever questions remain, we'll get to next week. We always save those questions. We don't just dump them. So I will respond to any questions that have come in that have not yet been answered in next Friday's session. look forward to then. And in the meantime, wish you well. It's a weird world out there, but hopefully we'll have an election that will settle things where the majority of folks will be happy, and where for the rest of us, whichever way that election goes, we want for both parties, both sides, to be able to live with each other and prosper. So we'd like to see some harmony coming out of this. Hopefully that will happen, but in the meantime, the guitar market goes on. Guitars are not political, and they outlive us. If you take good care of your guitar, it will last long enough for you, your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren, if they want to play it with good care. That guitar can outlast us all. We need to take care of them. They are part of our cultural legacy, an important part of American and world history. So till then, have a good one.